Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Hello and welcome to the Afternoon Light podcast, and today I'm talking to Dr. Bridget Brooklyn, who is a lecturer at Western Sydney University, and she's an expert on late 19th and 20th century Australian political and social history with a special interest in feminism, and she is the author of Did Petrov Matter? In the book Elections Matter, 10 Federal Elections That Shaped Australia, edited by Frank Bongiorno. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Bridget.
Thank you, Georgina. Lovely to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you on and to talk about the 1954 election. We've just recovered from the 2022 election and had a change of government and all the conclusions that have been drawn in the immediate aftermath, and of course the longer term implications of changes of government and the election and what went wrong and what went right, depending on which political persuasion you are or whether you're just an observer. But tell me about the 1954 election and why it is one of the 10 federal elections that shaped Australia.
The obvious thing about the 54 election is that it comes hard on the heels of the revelation of the defection of Vladimir Petrov from the Soviet embassy at the beginning of the election campaign. However, there are a number of reasons beyond that why the 54 election is important. Even though it's dubbed the Petrov election, it represents the consolidation of Menzies' long incumbency. And the tendency is to see that 16 years as monolithic, that from 1949 he's just sort of rusted on. But the first 5 years are really quite shaky for Menzies. And so the 54 election is a little bit of a watershed. We might say that 55 is the really deciding election for his incumbency. But in 54, we see the coming together of the Cold War anxieties generated by the Petrov revelations. But we also see the beginnings of post-war recovery, that in the 5 years since he was elected in 49, he's had quite a rocky time. There's been more or less galloping inflation. The economy has been very rocky, and so that really in the preceding years, 52 and 53 in particular, his ascendancy is quite shaky, and the polls suggest that if there had been an election in 52 or 53 that he wouldn't have won it. So 54 is important for that reason as well.
The result in terms of the two-party preferred vote is quite interesting, and I mean we have these sort of results from time to time. I think John Howard had one where he didn't win the two-party preferred vote, but he won the majority of seats. This is the same in this election, wasn't it?
Yes, it is. It's really it's a narrow victory in terms of percentage of the vote. 49.3 for the coalition and 50.7 for Labor. So it's quite a narrow victory, 7-seat victory to the coalition. So it's by no means a landslide. No,
and as you said, it that sense that it was easy for Menzies for 16 years. He was just had insurmountable political support and power is quite clearly not the case. What was the significance of the Petrov defection to the election? And I'm thinking, we're in the middle of the Cold War. It's really, really, really a dominating issue, not just in Australia but globally. It must have made a fair impact.
I think that impact has been overemphasised. It certainly did make an impact. But when we look at what's happening in the international scene generally, as compared to how Australians perceive what's happening internationally, yes, we've had a communist victory in China in 1949, and the victory of the Viet Minh in Vietnam occurs during the election campaign. This domino theory is a new one, that Eisenhower's falling domino speech occurs on the 7th of April 1954. So in some sense, we're well into the Cold War, but I don't see it as important, say, as when the Cold War really heats up in the following decade. So that really what concerns the Australian electorate are, yes, Cold War anxieties, but also anxieties about the immediate past. That really what leads to Chifley's defeat in 1949 is rationing and post-war austerity, and the promise of prosperity that Menzies offers, which he isn't able really to deliver in the early years. But the memory of depression and war, that those who are old enough to vote are old enough to remember both of those things. And so the wish to really put that behind them and to look forward to this promised prosperity is another really important thing I think, in the minds of voters when they go to the polls in May 1954.
Do you think, I mean, obviously acknowledging how important the hip pocket was as an election issue in 1954, and probably much more so than I think contemporary analysis would give it credit for, but do you think Menzies exploited the Petrov defection to his political advantage in that campaign through April, May 1954?
No, I don't think he did. I think the evidence is quite strong that he didn't. First of all, the evidence suggests that he really didn't know about even the possibility of a defection until February 1954, and then it was still only a possibility. But Petrov vacillated for a long time before he finally defected on the 3rd of April 1954. So really up until that time, ASIO is not sure if he's going to defect, that he's a somewhat volatile character, he's a heavy drinker, and there are all sorts of things going on. And really what is the catalyst for his defection is that his relationship with his superiors in the Soviet embassy have deteriorated so much that he is fearful about what might await him when he returns to the Soviet Union. So really, although the possibility of him defecting has been known to ASIO since mid-1953, the evidence suggests that Menzies was not aware of it until after he had defected, that the briefing that Colonel Charles Fry of ASIO gave him on the 10th of February 1954 was described as a preliminary briefing. And there the defection was still uncertain. So that at the very earliest, he knew then. There is a suggestion that he knew earlier than that, around September 1953, when an ASIO undercover worker, Dr. Michael Bielogusky, advised Menzies' private secretary, Jeffrey Yiend, that this could also take place. The evidence does suggest, it's not conclusive, but it does suggest that he didn't know about it then, that he staffed this out to Yiend, and that because it was only a possibility at that stage, there was no need to inform the Prime Minister. And so that the evidence does suggest that he really only knew of the actual defection after it had occurred, so on the 4th of April, and the announcement that he made was on the 13th.
During the campaign, was much made by Menzies of the defection? Did he refer to it much? Did he use his any anti-socialist rhetoric in relation to this and what it meant for Australia?
No, he didn't. He actually wanted his coalition colleagues not to mention Petrov. It did get mentioned a couple of times, but there are a number of reasons why he didn't. First of all, the press didn't take a very kind view of mention of Petrov, because the Royal Commission on Espionage had only just started sitting by the time of the election. And so nothing had been verified. So Menzies certainly felt that Petrov should be kept out of the campaign. Now, you can certainly mount a persuasive argument that he used other sort of Cold War type of rhetoric, the blurring of socialism and communism during his campaign, but so much is really directed towards domestic issues that he does want to evoke some of the unpopular things about the previous Chifley government that did lead to the Chifley government being defeated in 1949, that hadn't done enough to combat communism in the union movement. And although the 1949 coal strike was not a decisive matter for the defeat of the Chifley government, all of these kinds of things do get, Menzies does mention those kinds of things. The other important thing is just the really, I suppose, traditional tendency to go after these things as being what distinguishes Labor from the coalition and from the Liberal Party, the mass versus the individual. That the term socialism is used in a number of ways. Socialism is part of the Labor Party. The socialism objective is part of the Labor Party platform. It means something different from communism, but there is a bit of a blurring of the boundaries there. Socialism being, sort of strong Keynesian measures, communism being more this external threat, sort of Soviet-inspired insurgency and so forth. So he certainly does play on that. But again, those are the kinds of rhetorical devices he would have used, whether Petrov was part of the mix or not.
I think we look back on the 1950s and obviously the Petrov defection and the Royal Commission afterwards with a strong emphasis on the influence of communism and debates over communism. And I wonder how much we import the benefits of hindsight, I guess, and all that, the reflections on all that happened then. Obviously, Menzies trying to ban the Communist Party, the High Court case, and the positions that the Labor Party leader, Doc Evatt, took at the time. We look at all that happened and think, well, the 1950s were all about communism. Do you think that is incorrect? We've sort of exaggerated the importance of communism in the 1950s beyond how important it actually was?
Yes, I think we have, but this is, of course, always a peril to have the benefit of hindsight. And given how long the Cold War lasted, that it's in full swing by 1954, but when we look at it in the long view, it's still in the early days, and that it really does heat up in the decade to come. So there is a bit of a tendency to see this as monolithic and to also, so because the Cold War becomes so dominant in the second half of the 20th century, that does tend to colour our view of the 50s. And so we tend to underplay, I think, the backward-looking nature of the 50s, again, to think of the Australian electorate as positioned really still with these earlier memories of depression and war very fresh. Mm. And I think that's the biggest disadvantage of hindsight, that we forget that this is still very important. This post-war austerity is really what loses the election for Chifley in 1949. And given that it has been a tough few years, economically speaking, in Australia, up to 1954, that the fear, I think, of returning to that austerity or of the economy somehow delivering something pretty bleak is still in people's minds, because the economy has been so volatile. So we've had the Depression, but then in the wake of the Second World War, there is still rationing. And the fear of returning to that is probably in some sense greater than the fear of global communism. The other thing is that France, the French kicked out of Vietnam in early May 54, just before the election. But the impact of that isn't really felt by ordinary people. You might say that the impact is felt at a foreign policy level, but on the level of ordinary people, I don't think so. The Australians are not very sophisticated in their understanding of foreign policy. And so communism is they know that there's a Soviet Union and that there's a communist government in China, but of course the Vietnam War hasn't happened yet. So this threat of Asian communism is definitely there, certainly also in the wake of the Korean War, but that's sort of over. And so I think the tendency to see that as everybody, sort of looking under the beds for reds is overemphasised when we look back on the first half of the 1950s.
I wonder, Bridget, if you could comment on the importance of the two leaders in this 54 campaign. So we have Robert Menzies obviously leading what is still a very young political party, the Liberal Party of Australia. It had been formed in 44, but it won its first election in 49. So it's been in government for just 5 years or under 5 years. But then his alternate, the opposition leader at the time, Doc Evatt, I mean, a brilliant legal mind. Menzies and Doc Evatt have quite a similar sort of trajectory through getting scholarships, being brilliant students, being brilliant lawyers, and Doc Evatt really has an exceptional career as a barrister and jurist. They're two very similar, but obviously quite different figures, standing for quite different offerings and policy terms. This 54 election is described as one of those early presidential-style elections where you're pitching Menzies v Evatt, and the public obviously makes its choice, not terribly clearly, but it does make a choice. How do you see it as a evidence of a tendency in Australia to elevate the leader above the party?
Yes, it's not presidential, I suppose, in the way that elections become, but it does have the makings of that. And of course, Menzies is a very, although it's a young party, Menzies has been around for a long time, but importantly, as I think was mentioned in one of your previous podcasts, that he's learned from his years in the wilderness, and he's not just a brilliant mind, he's also learned the art of politics. And so although it's a young party, he's a very skilled politician by 54. Evatt is, something I read recently described him as worn out by 1951 when he becomes leader, because he does have this brilliant career behind him. And I think the important thing here is intellectual brilliance is not a guarantor of political success, that you do have to know the art of politics. And Evatt doesn't, that he is in some ways a bit of a lone wolf as a leader, not always consulting his caucus. And although his extreme volatility is not yet on display, that comes after the 54 election, there are nevertheless glimpses of him being somewhat intemperate in his style. And I think this is enough of a contrast to be able to make capital out of politically. And he has all of this brilliance, but he doesn't have the same leadership skills. That is on display during the election campaign. In their policy speeches, what Menzies offers is sort of moderate reforms. He offers certainly the not going down the route of the sort of dead hand of socialism, and against that, Evatt offers some very extravagant social welfare reforms that are uncosted, and it really does, the whole policy, it's not just the leadership, but the whole policy contrasts are very strong too, that what Evatt has to offer is immediately something that can be torn apart and is even challenged by people in his own party, notably Bill Burke, who sort of commits the sin of speaking against Labor policy by opposing this very controversial reform that Evatt offers in abolishing the means test on the old age pension. So, there are definitely the elements of presidential leadership style there, and also indicators that the ship of state might not be steered quite so adeptly under an Evatt government.
Yeah, and of course, overlaid across this is, and you've just alluded to it before, this Labor split. So there's a divergence in the Labor Party between particularly the Catholic Labor, who are fervently anti-communist, and other parts of Labor that have more sympathy or more acceptance of communist elements, particularly within the trade union movement. Could you see signs of that split before the 54 election? It was obviously bubbling away, and this was something that Evatt really mismanages pretty badly.
Yes, it was bubbling along, and I think that the split would have occurred anyway because the factions were really so strongly aligned against each other that we do have this strong Catholic right faction. The interesting thing is that the industrial groups are introduced by the Labor Party to foil communist membership in the union movement. It's a policy matter, but it becomes it gets out of control, really, that the left faction starts to get increasingly unhappy with the power that the so-called groupers have within the Labor Party. So that I think that showdown was always going to occur. It probably wouldn't have occurred so soon. I think it's unlikely that it would have been averted altogether, but certainly Evatt adds fuel to that fire, and really with going out on his own on things like the abolition of the means test in his election campaign, he really is adding fuel to that fire. And then that continues after the election. So really, the biggest damage is done after the election. But yes, we do see inklings of that in Evatt's really in his non-consultative style, I guess, that is, of course, going to get the Catholic right offside.
Do you think a different leader might have led to a different result, or was this an inevitability of the Labor Party in the 50s? There was just too much of a difference of opinion? Yes,
I think the only other leader that would have been possible at that stage would be Arthur Calwell, who also fell foul, even though he was a Catholic, certainly fell foul of the groupers. So during the split, he stayed with the left faction. He didn't go over to what became the DLP. So I don't think he would have been any more successful. I do think that the split would have occurred. It could have occurred in a different way with a more conciliatory leader, but I think that passions were running so hot by 1954 that certain things that Evatt did after the election, particularly his throwing down the gauntlet to the Victorian branch in October of that year, certainly escalated tension. But I can't think of a way that would have been averted altogether by another leader, because there was so much animosity between the factions by that stage.
And of course, the way Evatt conducted himself with the Royal Commission hearings, that would have particularly fed into concerns among the Catholic right of the Labor Party that he certainly was just not someone they could deal with.
Yeah, it is an interesting hypothetical to think that if he hadn't done some of the things that really put them offside. And yes, thinking back to his defence, that his appearing for the Waterside Workers' Federation in particular in the High Court challenge to the legislation to ban the Communist Party, that certainly was very much on the nose with the Catholic right, that he became associated with communists, essentially. And that was a lingering grievance. Under another leader, say Caldwell, that particular incident wouldn't have happened. So I'm still inclined to think that Evatt certainly hastened that split, but whether another leader could have averted it altogether is still, I think, doubtful. As we know, the Labor Party had a couple of other very destructive splits in its history, and I think this was a split that was many years in the making.
It's interesting reflecting on your description of the concern the Australian public had for austerity and the loss of the 49 election by Chifley, because people were just sick of rationing and living in constrained circumstances. That Evatt sort of doubles down on the, we're not going to be the party of rationing and austerity. We're going to have quite a large welfare spend. I mean, uncosted, as you said, promising a whole range of payments to different sectors of society. And that kind of blew up in his face. So where the public didn't want austerity, but they didn't also want a completely unaffordable set of welfare payments.
Indeed. I think it really is a time of moderation. I think that because there have been these extremes, that Australia has gone to war against fascism, there's fear of fascism now in the Cold War, there's fear of communism. So these two extremes, I think, are in the back of people's minds. So yes, they don't want austerity, but they do want to feel this confidence in their leader. And I think the other thing that's really important when we think about leaders is that in the death of Chifley, they have lost a leader that was regarded as a very sensible leader, even though he was voted out in 49, that Labor is still very popular, that it's a fairly narrow victory in 49 and a very narrow victory in 54, that legacy of, say, post-war reconstruction, the beginnings of mass immigration, all of these big public spending ventures have the approval of the Australian electorate. But that's another thing from going down a path that is possibly unstable. So stability and moderation are really something that, say, for the most part, the Chifley government and then the incoming Menzies government had in common. And in the chapter I refer to the two landmark speeches of the respective parties, the Light on the Hill and the Forgotten People, as being both appealing to this very middle road that I think Australians want to travel down in the 40s and 50s. So it's still in the 50s, despite the Cold War. They're really concerned with domestic issues, and someone who will lead them through that post-war austerity and fears of the inflation that's been occurring, the unemployment, that now that things are starting to get on track in early 54, that Menzies seems to be on the track to deliver those things so that they have confidence in him. But they still, given the narrowness of the result, there is still I suppose, an affection for and adherence to the role of government as offering sort of Keynesian reforms. This is very much a Keynesian era on both sides of politics.
Well, that's right. That Australian settlement, as Paul Kelly describes it, there's very little of what we would understand now as the kind of, capital L Liberal Party's commitment to economic conservatism back in Menzies' era. He is a Keynesian, while he might not have been an Keynesian in extremis like Evatt would have been if elected. He certainly does believe in protected economy, in tariffs, in government spending, in certain aspects of nation building that we might not necessarily have seen in iterations of the 80s and 90s of both Liberal and Labor. Bridget, you write about an Australian tendency to conservatism, and that the 54 election was indicative of this, that Australians like to keep the status quo in that sort of middle of the road, and they're pretty unkeen to go down either extreme, and that it's been written about that it's partly because of our compulsory voting system. We actually, all have to vote. So the extremes, yes, they have a voice and at the ballot box, but majority of people are not into the extremes in either direction. So can you tell me about how this election does give you a taste of Australians' natural tendency to conserve?
Right, yeah. Yes, I think when we look at elections over the rest of the 20th century, we could say, I do think that there are things about the 1950s that perhaps make Australians more inclined to take that middle-of-the-road approach, but that even if we go to 1972, the Whitlam victory is not a landslide by any means. And so people are ready for a change by then, but then change happens too fast. And so the Whitlam government becomes very unpopular very quickly. And I think that also affirms this rather cautious approach that the Australian electorate has in general, that the sort of extreme, extravagant promises and extravagant spending doesn't go down well. So that if you're going to, given that you do have to vote, that you're going to take a more steady as she goes approach. Generally, of course, there are times when we do see big changes happening, but even with those big changes, you might say 49 is a big change because there have been two very successful Labor governments, and 72 is a big change. But if you look a bit more below the surface, you can see that these sort of everyday concerns do drive the electorate generally, I think, in its voting behaviour.
And I wondered if you could reflect on post-1954 and what that meant for, the success and longevity of the Menzies government, but also the fortunes of the Labor Party. I mean, in just 18 months after the 54 election, Australians went to the polls again in 55. Menzies was adept at using all manner of electoral techniques, timing of double dissolutions and, half Senate elections and the like to his advantage, calling early elections. It must have been an exhausting time for people going to vote. The AEC must have been run off its feet. But tell me about the post-54 electoral landscape and how that manifested in Australian politics.
Well, I suppose the most important thing is when we look at that long incumbency that really does become established very well and truly in the 55 election, that it is the Labor's disarray that contributes to that long incumbency, that the Labor vote becomes split, that we do have the splitting off of the Catholic right into what becomes the DLP, and these are long wilderness years for the Labor Party. So that really does, in some sense, I think that there are many things that I think make Menzies suit the times, that it is a time that becomes gradually more prosperous, and the government of the day tends to take the blame or the credit for the economic situation. So you have that the times are working for him in many ways, but also that he is a very able leader. And then you have this strong contrast that Labor is sort of very much demoralised and fragmented by the split. It's hard to say which of the three Labor splits of the 20th century were the most damaging, but the 55 split was an extremely damaging split. So we can't really underestimate that sort of negative effect that it has on the political landscape in the years after 54.
So really 54, Menzies bacon is saved by the Australian electorate. It's a real near run thing, and that sets him up for power until 66. But he does have another near miss, doesn't he, in 61. He just survives that election against opposition leader Arthur Calwell with his deputy in a younger Gough Whitlam, of course.
Yeah. I think that the split really is responsible for that. I think that from the early 1960s you can see a resurgent Labor Party, but it is still split. And certainly one argument is that that Labor would have won if it hadn't been split. But the Labor vote is still being split between those who vote for the Labor Party, those who used to be part of the Catholic right in the Labor Party, now have their own party to vote for. So, and it takes a long time for this change to occur. This is also after Menzies, the possibility, the sense that Labor was going to win the 69 election, but has its hopes dashed there. So I still think that consequences of the split are still being played out in the 61 election.
And do you think that the female vote had an influence on these elections particularly? I mean, we've just seen an election here in 2022 where women made their voice heard. Well, according to commentators, at least, we haven't seen the sort of breakdown yet of the real analysis of who voted which way. But the commentators seem to feel that women voted against the government and for at least independents or the Labor Party in greater numbers than men. For Menzies, who was talking about hip pocket issues, who was appealing to the middle ground, who did appeal to policies that favoured strong families and employment, and of course, the Labor Party was pitching to workers, to an industrial complex that women weren't necessarily part of in the 50s. How much did women influence these results?
I don't know exactly how much they influenced them. It's certain that that Menzies was able to communicate with women in a way that Labor didn't. I think it's important to bear in mind that, yes, that when he's communicating to women, it is as homemakers and those who are in charge of the family budget, and it is as women as members of the family, that not as women as potential members of the workforce. So that the gender issue then is very different from the gender issue in the recent election, and it's hard to look at this without the benefit of hindsight, because as you mentioned in my introduction, the history of feminism is one of my interests, and I do see the 50s as quite an important decade from that perspective too, because even though, again, we tend to typify the 50s as, the nuclear family and the male breadwinner and the female homemaker, and that certainly is representative of demographically of the majority of Australians. But there are, things are changing, and change has a long lead time. So in the post-war environment, women are starting to change their expectations of their role in the family. So while Menzies can communicate very well to women who might be very happy in that role, I'm not sure in the long term how much a difference gender makes in the way people vote, because the Labor Party also earlier in the century has had a strong record on women's participation in the workforce and equal pay and so forth. So it's quite a complicated picture, but certainly from the point of view of regarding women's contribution to the domestic economy in the form of their homemaking, I think Menzies does recognise that and see the need to speak directly to women in a way that other politicians haven't.
Well, I think that's definitely much more of a discussion for another day, Bridget. There's, the importance of the female vote, and, it shouldn't just be seen as one amorphous whole, because women have lots of different views and lots of different perspectives and life experience and different expectations of how they want to live their lives. So it cannot be considered just in one cohort with one set of conclusions to be drawn. But it's really interesting because it is, a powerful determinant of who gets elected ultimately. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Bridget. It's been a delight talking to you about the 54 election and the lead up and the fallout and how important it was for the rest of that era, and of course one of the elections that defined modern Australia. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having me.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.